The first thing I saw when I stepped out of the taxi was a little girl standing behind my neighbor's screen door, staring at me as though she had just seen someone return from the dead. The second thing I saw was Claire Whitmore bursting through that door, running barefoot across the sunlit yard with tears streaming down her face. She did not stop at the fence. She did not slow down when the gravel cut into her feet. She simply crossed the distance between us and threw her arms around me so desperately that my sea bag slipped from my shoulder and landed in the driveway. Then, with her face pressed against my chest, she whispered the words that shattered every expectation I had carried home after 6 months at sea. She told me that my father was gone, that he had died believing I would never forgive him, and that he had left something behind that only she could give me. Before we continue, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, because sometimes the people we think have abandoned us are the very ones who spend their final days trying to guide us home. My name is Everett Sloan, and until that morning, I believed I understood loneliness. I worked as a marine engineer on a commercial cargo vessel, spending months surrounded by steel walls, roaring engines, endless water, and men who learned not to ask personal questions. The sea was honest in a way people rarely were. It could be calm at sunrise and violent by noon, but it never pretended to love you while preparing to leave. I had accepted the 6-month contract because I needed the money, but the truth was harder to admit. I had also wanted distance from my father, Graham Sloan, a stubborn retired shipbuilder who lived alone in the weathered blue house where I had grown up. Our last conversation had ended with accusations that had been waiting years to escape. I blamed him for my mother's death, for choosing work over family, for becoming colder after she was gone, and for treating grief like a weakness that could be repaired with silence. He accused me of running away whenever life became painful. I left the following morning without saying goodbye, convinced that 6 months at sea would give him time to understand how badly he had failed me. Claire lived in the small white cottage next door with her 8-year-old daughter, Maisie. She had moved into the neighborhood 3 years earlier after losing her husband in a highway accident, and my father had helped repair her porch without accepting payment. I had known her only through brief conversations over the fence and the occasional cup of coffee she brought when I was working on my truck. She was thoughtful without being intrusive, and there was a steadiness in her presence that made people feel safe. Before I left, she had asked whether I wanted her to check on my father. I told her he did not need anyone, and she replied that needing help and admitting it were not the same thing. I remembered dismissing her words. Now she stood in my driveway with bleeding feet and trembling hands, trying to explain that my father had collapsed 2 months earlier while repairing a cabinet in his workshop. By the time Claire found him, he had already suffered a massive stroke. He lived for 9 days in the hospital, unable to speak clearly, but fully aware that I was somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary phone service. That I pulled away from Claire, not because I wanted distance, but because grief had suddenly turned my body into something unfamiliar. The neighborhood looked exactly as I had left it. Sunlight lay across the lawns. A sprinkler clicked 2 houses down. A delivery van rolled slowly past. My father's truck still sat beneath the maple tree, and his coffee mug was visible through the kitchen window. Everything appeared normal, yet the man who had filled that house with the sound of tools, heavy footsteps, and restrained disappointment no longer existed inside it. I asked why no one had contacted the shipping company. Claire said they had tried. She had called the emergency number I left with my father, but the vessel had been rerouted after a mechanical failure, and messages were delayed through several offices. My father had refused to let the hospital keep searching. He had written on a pad that I had chosen the sea, and he did not want his death used as a chain to drag me back. That sentence wounded me because it sounded exactly like him: proud, bitter, protective, and impossible to understand until it was too late. Claire led me into my father's house while Maisie quietly picked up my fallen sea bag. The air smelled of cedar dust and stale coffee. A thin layer of sunlight stretched across the hallway floor, revealing tiny scratches from years of boots and furniture. On the kitchen table sat a wooden box with my name carved into the lid. The carving was uneven, as though made by a weak hand. Claire told me my father had worked on it during his last days, holding the engraving tool with fingers that barely obeyed him. Inside were 6 sealed envelopes, one for each month I had been gone, along with a brass key, my mother's wedding ring, and a photograph I had never seen. The picture showed my parents standing beside a half-finished fishing boat when they were young. My mother was laughing, and my father was looking at her rather than the camera. He looked open, gentle, almost fearless. I had spent years believing he had never known how to love her properly, yet the photograph captured a tenderness so obvious that I felt ashamed for having doubted it. The first envelope was dated 3 days after I left. My father admitted that our argument had frightened him because much of what I said was true. He wrote that after my mother became ill, he accepted extra work because the medical bills were growing faster than he could pay them. He never told me how close we came to losing the house. He missed hospital visits not because he valued work more than her, but because she had begged him to keep our family financially secure. When she died, he carried the guilt of every hour spent away from her bedside. He believed showing grief would make my own pain worse, so he became rigid and practical, repairing broken doors while ignoring the broken hearts inside the house. The second letter described how he stood outside my bedroom many nights, hearing me cry but feeling too ashamed to enter. The third apologized for every time he mistook silence for strength. By the fourth, his handwriting had begun to shake. By the fifth, he wrote that he had finally understood why I had gone to sea. I was not escaping him. I was searching for a place where no one expected me to forgive what I could not yet understand. The 6th envelope had been written in the hospital. The words were large and uneven, but each one felt painfully deliberate. My father said Claire had helped him hold the pen. He did not ask me to forgive him. He said forgiveness demanded too much from the wounded person when the guilty one had little time left. Instead, he asked me not to inherit his loneliness. He wrote that pride had cost him the chance to comfort his wife, the courage to comfort his son, and the humility to say he was afraid. He said the brass key opened the old boat shed by the harbor, where he had spent the months before my departure restoring the fishing boat from the photograph. He had planned to give it to me when I came home. The final line read that a man could spend his life building vessels strong enough to cross oceans and still fail to build a bridge across a kitchen table. I pressed the letter against my chest and wept with a violence I had not allowed myself since my mother's funeral. And the days that followed, I moved through grief as though walking across a deck during heavy waves. Claire brought meals but never stayed unless I asked. Maisie left small drawings beneath my door, most of them showing a blue boat beneath a bright yellow sun. Neighbors stopped by with stories about my father that I had never heard. He had repaired a veteran's wheelchair ramp without charge, paid for a teenager's welding course, and quietly delivered groceries to a widower who could no longer drive. Every kindness seemed to belong to a stranger who had worn my father's face. Anger rose beneath my sorrow. I wanted to know why he could give patience to everyone except me. Claire finally told me that guilt often made people kinder to strangers because strangers did not know where they had failed. Loving me had reminded my father of everything he believed he had done wrong. His distance had not been the absence of love. It had been love distorted by shame. The brass key opened a rusted padlock on the harbor shed. Inside, sunlight streamed through gaps in the wooden boards and fell across the restored fishing boat. My mother's name, Evelyn, had been painted carefully along the bow. The hull gleamed beneath layers of fresh varnish, and the small cabin contained 2 bunks, a compact stove, and a framed copy of the photograph from the wooden box. On the workbench lay my father's tools beside an unfinished plaque. Claire explained that he had wanted the boat to become something more than a gift. He had dreamed of using it to take grieving families onto the bay, giving them a peaceful place to remember those they had lost. He believed the sea could hold sorrow without judging it. Claire knew because he had told her while repairing her porch, after learning how suddenly she had lost her husband. That was why she had run across the yard when I returned. She had not only been carrying news of my father's death. She had been carrying his unfinished hope. I initially rejected the idea. I planned to sell the boat, the house, and everything connected to a man I no longer had the chance to confront. My shipping company had already offered me another contract, and returning to sea seemed easier than living among unanswered questions. Claire did not argue. She simply asked me to take the boat out once before making the decision. On a bright Sunday morning, we launched Evelyn into the calm bay with Maisie sitting between us in a yellow life jacket. The engine turned over smoothly. As the shoreline receded, the noise inside me began to soften. Claire scattered a handful of white flower petals across the water in memory of her husband. Maisie placed one of her drawings beside them. I held my mother's wedding ring in my palm and read the final letter again while the sunlight moved across the waves. For the first time, I imagined my father alone in that shed, shaping wood with tired hands, hoping to create the apology he could not speak. When we returned to the harbor, I found an older man waiting beside the dock. His name was Walter Crew, a former apprentice at my father's shipyard. He handed me a folded document showing that my father had placed the boat and a modest savings account into a small charitable trust. The trust was incomplete because it still required my signature. My father had named the project Evelyn's Passage and described its purpose in simple terms: free daytime trips for people facing grief, illness, or family separation. Walter said my father had worried I would see the plan as one final obligation forced upon me. He had told Walter that I deserved the freedom to refuse. That changed something inside me. For years, I believed my father wanted to control my choices, yet his last act had protected my right to walk away. I signed the documents that afternoon, not because I owed him, but because I finally understood what he had been trying to become. The first official trip took place 3 weeks later. Claire helped organize it, and Maisie designed a small sign for the dock. Our passengers were a mother and teenage son who had recently lost their husband and father to cancer. They barely spoke when they boarded. We traveled slowly along the coastline beneath a clear afternoon sky, stopping near a quiet cove where the water reflected the cliffs. The mother began telling stories about her husband's terrible singing, his burnt pancakes, and the way he always carried extra gloves in winter. Her son laughed for the first time in months, then cried without hiding his face. Watching them, I understood that grief did not need to be solved. It needed room. My father had spent his life believing pain should be contained, but in the end, he built a place where people could release it. Over the next year, Evelyn's Passage carried dozens of families across the bay. I declined the long shipping contracts and accepted local engineering work that allowed me to stay. Claire became the heart of the project, coordinating families and listening to their stories with the compassion she once offered my father. Maisie grew fearless on the water and insisted on welcoming every passenger personally. My relationship with Claire changed slowly, through shared coffee on the dock, quiet repairs in the boat shed, and the understanding that neither of us needed to replace the people we had lost. We simply allowed hope to stand beside grief. On the anniversary of my father's death, Claire and I placed a finished plaque inside the cabin. It carried the words he had been unable to complete: no ocean is wider than the distance created by unspoken love, and no journey home begins too late. Before we brought the boat back to shore that day, I left my father's final letter beneath the framed photograph of my parents. I told him aloud that I forgave him, though forgiveness no longer felt like erasing the past. It meant seeing the whole person instead of only the wound they caused. It meant admitting that he had failed me and loved me at the same time. It meant accepting that I had also used anger to avoid the vulnerability of missing him. As the boat moved through the bright afternoon water, Claire reached for my hand, and Maisie leaned against my shoulder. I realized I had returned from 6 months at sea expecting only an empty house. Instead, I had come home to a purpose, a family I had not planned for, and a final gift from a father who had spent his last strength building a bridge he would never get to cross. Please leave a meaningful comment about someone you wish you could forgive, thank, or speak to before it is too late. Your words may encourage another person to take the first step toward healing. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Everett Sloan never received the goodbye he thought he needed, but he learned that love sometimes survives inside unfinished letters, restored boats, barefoot footsteps across a yard, and the courage to come home. And every time Evelyn's passage carried another grieving family into the sunlight, Everett felt his father beside him, not as the silent man who had failed to speak, but as the man who finally found a way to say everything.